If you're getting ready to do your first podcast interview, listen to this episode first to maximize your results. Maybe you've done interviews before and wonder why you're not seeing the results everyone else is. The answer is in this interview. Or maybe you're doing podcast interviews and the results is sporadic. Well, there's a reason, and the reason is in this interview. We'll walk through the 5 steps that will keep you or enable you to get results from every podcast interview. It's not magic. It's a system that we dig into right here.
Hey, Tom. Welcome.
Tiffany, I'm glad to be on this side in the podcast interview marketing show.
Exactly. Over the last couple of years, this is not our first discussion or training together. We've done many over the last couple of years, but this will be our first one here on the podcast interview marketing show, which I'm excited about.
Well, it's a new medium and great information and answering a lot of the questions that people are asking and continually ask.
That's our whole goal and objective with the show. And we talked about the couple of recordings that we've done the several, actually, we've done quite a few. All of those are over on interviewvalet.com under the resources tab under the navigation there. So if you're new to Interview Valet and following us, I invite you over there to check out the other discussions Tom and I have done. But today, I'm excited to have a more focused conversation just about podcast interview marketing, right? I think the conversation for us, Tom, is talking about common rebuttals that we might hear, right, from podcast guests who've done interviews and whatnot. And the big one I'm going to kick off right out the bat with you, Tom, is those who say podcast interview marketing doesn't work. What is your initial response to that when you hear that?
I smile. I'm like, oh, let's get into this discussion. Because often people say it and they'll say, podcast interview marketing doesn't work. And we'll talk about it. And they're doing random podcast appearances. That's like saying that fishing doesn't work or baking doesn't work or cars don't work, right? Because I built a car and it doesn't work. So therefore cars don't work. It's like, are you doing it in the proper way? Are you leaving something out, right? If there's a missing piece, and that's what we're sort of talking about here. What's that missing piece that's keeping you from getting results, right? If you're baking, if you leave the baking powder out, the cake won't rise, right? So don't say baking doesn't work. Figure out what the missing piece is. If you're fishing and you forgot to put the hook on, right? Don't say fishing doesn't work because you're not getting results. Other people are getting results with it, right? So I would say the same thing with podcast interview marketing. When somebody says that, I'm like, okay, let's look at the 5 things. After we go through all of these, if you've got all of these and it's still not working, then I'll agree with you. But usually we don't even get to the second one and they're like, oh, I never thought about that. So, let's sort of dive into those.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that it simply does work, right? If you are, like you said, the analogy of baking, if you're putting all your key ingredients together in a measurement that makes sense for you and your business model, you will see those results. And we just know that over our experience over the last 9 years of helping many coaches, consultants, industry leaders, they get results when they do it correctly. And it's when they're looking at it as a system, as a process, as a marketing tool in their business, rather than saying yes to any show that will say yes to them. Right. So where should we begin with that? You mentioned the 5 areas. Should we start with number 1 and work our way down that list?
You already started with number 1, right? And
Yes.
I'll tell you right from the very beginning here, right? It's audience, attitude, offers, attribution, and amplifying. I'm sorry, I couldn't come up with an A for offers, but the audience. That's what you brought up there, right? Of
Yeah.
what shows are you going on, right? If it's just random shows, if you're putting something out on Facebook and saying I'll go on any show, or going on there's some different dating services, right? If you will, out there.
Exactly.
There's some matchmaking platforms, and I always say it's like dating off of Craigslist, right? There's some nice people there,
Yeah.
but you're probably going to have to kiss a whole lot of frogs to find the prince. So my first one is, are you talking to the right audience? Right? Years ago, somebody told me you can't say enough of the right things to the wrong people, or the wrong things to the right people. So you don't just want to be heard by everyone. If someone doesn't understand your problem, the problem that you're trying to show them a solution to, they won't value the solution, right? And often you can say the audience is often like the host, or aspires to be like the host, right? So if you're want to talk to, you know, females that, I'm trying to think of different clients here that we've worked with, right? There was one, they had a great product for menopausal women, right?
Mhm.
That's a great audience there. Don't talk to a host that's in his mid 20s and male, right? Could be a great podcast, but not a great podcast for you. Or make sure that they're talking about the right things, right? So another example here, had a client that came and said, I want to talk to Fortune 500 CEOs. And I'm like, yes, we can target those, but there's not a podcast called the Fortune 500 CEO podcast with 500 listeners, right? So he had mentioned a podcast, and it's a great podcast. And he said, I'd love to be on there. And I said, do you really think that Fortune 500 CEOs are listening to that? And he's like, no. I'm like, no, they talk about how to make your first million, the 6 hacks to make 6 figures in 6 seconds. Now, for the right audience, it'd be the right podcast, but I don't care how good your offer is. If you go into a podcast like that, talking about your consulting services, how you can transform them, how you can make their processes easier, how you can manage cash flow, all the rest of these things. Those people don't have that problem yet, right? They're just trying to figure out how how to go from a side hustle to quitting their job. They're not even thinking about those things yet. So you could have the best product, but you're talking to the wrong audience. And often we'll have somebody that comes to us and they're saying, hey, I never got results. And we start to pull up their interviews in our database. And Tiffany, I can usually figure out who somebody's target audience is by listening to or looking at their last 5 podcast interviews. But if they are all over the board and they don't know who their ICP is, ideal client prospect or profile, right? If they don't know that, just just going in random places won't work, right? It's almost like the idea of, I want to go fishing, right? I know fish are in water, right? Well, you can fish in a swimming pool, you can fish in a puddle, you can fish in Lake Michigan, you can fish in the ocean, right? If you're fishing
Yeah.
for sharks, there's only one place that's going to have them, right? It better be salt water. So trying to really get more focus on that. And I'll say again, for audience, if you find the perfect audience, it will convert, right? You can't say enough of the wrong things to the right people, or the right things to the wrong people. So that's my rant on why it doesn't work. Maybe you're not talking to the best audience.
Right. And I think that one being number one is intentional, because if you have that wrong, none of the other five key areas are even relevant, right? If you're not having the right conversation with the right people. We all also use the analogy of, it's better to talk to a room of 100 of your ideal clients and ideal customers than 10,000 of the wrong ones, right? Because they're not interested, and you're going to work a lot harder to resonate and connect with that wrong audience and probably not see many results or much interest there.
Yeah. Often I'll hear people say, I just need a bigger audience, right? If I was on the bigger shows, it would convert, right? This is all a numbers game. I heard somebody say that the other day. Marketing is just a numbers game. Well, then send a million emails. See what a million spam emails do for you. And it's not a numbers game. It's a focus game, right? And if you're not converting on a small show, figure out why before you try going on a bigger show. You're a Navy spouse. We had a phrase in the Navy, right? It was called doubling down on stupid, right? If it's not working at a small show, don't try it on a big show because it won't work there either. And you're only going to get a certain number of shots at those big shows.
And you don't want that your big show, right? Your top show to be your first interview either. You need to work up to that audience and hone that message and your delivery and all of that. So it's probably not even a good idea to start there if that's not quite where you're at in your industry anyway. Um, so with that, I mean, we could probably spend a whole episode talking about audience alignment and messaging, right? Um, should we then go into to keep progressing here with attitude, right? That's number two on the key areas to check. Um, what's the right attitude to have when it comes to podcast guesting and podcast interview marketing? Because it is different than other marketing channels, right? Then it's so you need a different approach than you would typically take in other channels that maybe they've used in the past.
And sometimes the more trained you are, the harder you have with this, right? We'll have some people that come to us and say, well, I've got my keynote down and I'll just go give my keynote. That's a creepy discussion, right? Or other people are like, I've got all my points from a webinar. I did this perfect infomercial. I'll do that same thing. Well, podcast interviews are discussions. They're not keynotes. They're not monologues, and they're not webinars. They're not an infomercial, right? If you try that,
Yeah.
it won't work. Often the host won't even let the interview go live, right? They're like, no, you don't get to come and pitch to my audience, right? You shouldn't be selling on a podcast interview. Now, and I really believe this because often people will come with, I am here to sell my product, my service, whatever it is, my expertise. Well, people don't go to podcasts to be sold to. And I would say a lot of times now people don't want to be sold to. We sell products, we buy services, right? So you want to be out there educating people so that they can say, wow, Tiffany understands my problem. She understands the market. She's worked with people like me, right? I want to talk with her about solving my problem. So you should come with
Mhm.
this attitude of education, of service, of having a discussion, right? Not doing a creepy sales call, right? Podcasts are not the place for transactional sales. If you just want to do a quick transaction, buy some Facebook ads, throw them through a funnel, right? It's low touch, high volume, low margin, right? What
Yeah.
podcast interviews are, you come with the attitude of, I want to earn the know, like, and trust. I want to be seen as a industry leader. I want to control the conversation here. And if you do that, you will draw people to you, right? Gary Vaynerchuk wrote a book called Jab, 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 Right Hook, right? I always say, give, 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 ask, right? Keep giving value, giving support. People will ask how they want to work with you. And that's something that we try figuring out early on in our new client process, right? You can tell, is someone there to use and abuse an audience, or are they there for the mutual benefit? And that's really a litmus test, right? We look at it as our mission at Interview Valet is to personally introduce inspiring thought leaders to millions of people they could serve for the betterment of all. So if you come to a podcast interview and your heart is not there for the betterment of all, I think you're really going to have struggles ever getting results from it.
Absolutely. And I think part of that is attributed to the medium in which the audience is ingesting the interview, right? It's usually pretty personal, right? You're in their ear, in an earbud. It is something they are self-selecting to hear, right? I listen to this podcast because I want to know more about marketing or branding or building my brand, or I want to hear what other coaches or consultants in the industry, what are they doing so I can be a better coach or consultant. So they're doing this as a it's educational for them, right? We're learning from others. What are the other experts doing? And you're in their ear, and if they're just listening to a sales pitch, they're going to turn it off, because that's not why they subscribe to that podcast, right? That's not what they tuned in to hear. Um, so yeah, that's where attitude and approach is important. I think more important in this medium than probably any other marketing channel you might be doing.
And that really brings us sort of to the next one, right? What's that next step that you want them to take, right? If you start being pushy, right? If you start self-promoting yourself, I tell you what their next step is. They're going to turn you off, or the host will cut you off, right? I always think of DJ Doug Sandler from Nice Guys on Business. He's like, you don't have to promote yourself, right? If you do a good job, I, as the host, will promote you better than you ever could. But you better tell people what the next steps are, right? Those offers, right? None of us, okay, I'll speak for myself. I am not a good enough communicator to solve everyone's problems in 30 minutes. There's always that next step. So make it easy for them. Tell them what the next step you want them to take is. And now, this is heresy in marketing, right? Every digital marketer is going to tell you one call to action. That's off of a different medium, right? With podcast interviews, we've tested it over and over. HubSpot's looked at the data, and they've seen that it's always 3 calls to action always convert best, right? Meet people where they are. So at the end of the podcast, and I'll listen so many times to people that say podcast interviews don't work. I won't even listen to the full podcast. I'll go the last 3 minutes. And it's like, you got to the end, you had them there, and then you lost them, right? You didn't tell them what they could do next, or you confused them, right? Going to my website to sign up for a newsletter is not an offer, right? Nobody wants another newsletter. So you want to give them 3 ways to say yes: a small yes, a medium yes, and a heck yes. So the small yes is just something to get them back there, right? Doesn't take them a lot of time, doesn't take them a lot of money. It shouldn't be a lot of homework. It could be anything from a checklist to an assessment to something they could download and maybe even share with the decision maker. Now, the medium yes, it's going to take a little bit more time or a little bit more money. It's for those people that need something more to jump into a sales conversation. So it could be a free copy of a book. It could be a face-to-camera video, testimonials, a webinar, something like that that's going to take them a little bit more time. So we have the small yes, the medium yes, the heck yes, right? When someone hears you and you are the answer to prayer, don't slow them down in the funnel, right? Whales don't click, big fish don't swim through funnels. If you think you're going to do a professional services engagement, right, and somebody's going to hear you on a podcast, and then they're going to spend 6 months in a funnel and a drip sequence before they sign your 6-figure contract, it doesn't happen that way, right? They hear you. You're the answer to prayer. They want to jump on a call. So make it easy for them. It could be an initial product. It could be a discovery call, however the sales go. But make sure that you think through that, because at the end of every interview, they're going to ask you a question, and it's going to be something like this. So, Tiffany, how can people find out about you? Or so, Tiffany, what else do you have? Any final words? So you want to be at that point, move people from being just a passive listener to an active visitor and engaged lead, right? Give them a reason to take that next step.
And podcast interview marketing it's a long game, right? It's not a one and done transaction. There's things that you need to do ahead of time to lead up to it, prepare, show up for the interview, and then things after. Like you said, the best way to promote and get your interview out there is to do a good interview on a podcast, and that host, their audience, will be your biggest advocates, and the promoting will take care of itself, and then you share it with your audience. But I love the idea of the 3 offers because it attaches to the first 2, right? We talked about audience, and finding the right audience. Having the right offers, those 3 offers in the small, medium, and heck yes, allows that listener to allows you to meet that listener where they are in their journey. Like you said, you're going to have people that maybe they're dipping their toes into whatever your service is. They like that small offer. Then you have others who listened to your 30-45 minute interview and they show up credit card in hand, like, I'm ready for your consulting services, I am ready to sign up for your business. And so that's really the best way to do it. And we've talked to so many people, I know I have, I'm sure you have, who that the idea of 3 calls to action is foreign to them, right? They're like, no, digital marketing has said this, and that, like, it's tried and true. And that we have found that's not the case. But as we've a common thread here is that interview marketing is a different platform than other marketing channels. So it needs to be treated as such, right?
And the people that say, no, just give them one call to action, you say, well, why? Well, you don't want to confuse them.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. But then these are also the people that say, you can find me here on Twitter. You can find me here on LinkedIn. Email me here. Phone, text me here, right? They're giving these people all these different places to go, and they're making it hard for people, and they have no way to attribute the traffic,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're trying to use this medium like they would a webinar where people can see you, where they run it at 1x speed, right? The studies show that 70% of people listen to podcasts sped up. They're also multitasking. So this is really the 4th step is attribution. Send them to one place. Make sure you can track it. Make sure it's your place, right? Amazon and LinkedIn, they get plenty of traffic. You don't need to send more there. So what you want to do at the end of a podcast interview is give them one place to go on your website, right? Often we'll call this a welcome page, right? So you make a page and you clone it for every interview. And at the end, you just say, well, Tiffany, if you like this, just come over back to interviewvalet.com/Tiffany, or whatever the name of the podcast is. And then say, here are the 3 things that we'll have for you there. That's small yes, medium yes, and heck yes. And then once again, you say, here's the address for it. And not only does it make it easy for people to move from being just a listener to a visitor, but they know what they're going to get there. And this is the only way I have ever heard of anybody able to attribute the traffic. And let me get a little bit in there too, because there's this lie in marketing today that everything is attributable. I'm not sure if that's a word, but I heard this from Rand Fishkin. And Rand is a genius when it comes to SEO, right? He said if he spoke at a podcast or he spoke at a conference and somebody heard him and it's like, oh yeah, I want to work with him. They go to the internet, they search for him, they don't get his name spelt right correctly. Well, Google's going to say, I brought you that traffic, right? I brought him to your site. All right. Now you get there and you get distracted, right? You close it, close the browser, and now Facebook retargeting gets you back there, right? Facebook is going to say, well, we brought you that traffic, right? Well, no, it's a little bit of Facebook, a little bit of Google, but the first thing was that live event or that podcast interview. And if you believe that you have to 100% attribute everything, then you should stop doing networking. You should stop doing public speaking. You should stop doing podcast interviews, right? But if you're doing podcast interviews, for God's sake, send them to one place to make it easy for them. And also, you can attribute so that you know that when this podcast does really, really well, you've got that feedback to either try going on that podcast again or going back to find other ones like that, right? If you don't have that feedback, it's almost like going again to my fishing analogy, right? If you don't know that the fish aren't biting in the pool, why would you ever move on from there, right? So you need that attribution. Send them to one place and make sure it's your place.
Right. And that continues the give, right? That you mentioned earlier. It combines with the idea of podcast interview marketing that it is relationship building, right? It's not a transaction. And two, we found also listeners really appreciate it, right? Because those welcome pages are customized to that interview, that specific podcast. Um, it shows like they care about me, right? They're interested in my pain points, what I need, and how they can serve me. And so that's another thing. It's again, we're going back to the pie analogy, the baking analogy of it's all these little pieces you're putting together to make a greater whole. To put it's an entire system.
It's and all of this we've gotten, it's common sense, but it's only common sense once you see it. And often, when somebody says it doesn't work, I'll listen to the last 3 minutes of their podcast interview and say, oh yeah, you're missing the offers. You're missing the attribution. And then I'll go to their social media and I'm like, and instead of doing more interviews, you should have done more with the content, right? Often people will say the reason it's that I'm not getting the results is because I'm not doing enough interviews, right? It's this idea that if I just did more interviews, it's a numbers game. I would get more out of it. And I always tell people, more is not better. Better is better. Steve Acho taught me that years ago, a client. And the other thing is to don't just do more interviews, do more with the interviews. And that's the fifth missing link that I see from people, right? I'll go to their social media and they've done all these podcast interviews, but they've never repurposed it. They've never promoted it. For heaven's sakes, if this audience was your ideal audience, you wanted to get in front of them, why wouldn't you take that content, repost it, reuse it, get short reels out of it, tag the host in it? Because if you tag the host in it, they're probably going to mention it. They're going to see it. And now you're going to get in front of that audience again, right? And not their entire audience of people listen to their podcast. So now you're not only talking to this ideal audience that listen to the podcast, but the ideal audience that follows this thought leader. It's like, why wouldn't you do that? It doesn't take you any more time. And maybe you could just throw some money at it and get it repurposed there. But it's those things where people just come back and going back to your initial question. Well, podcast interview marketing doesn't work. I can show you 9 years of case studies that prove that wrong. But I can also show you that random appearances where you don't worry about the audience, you go in with the wrong attitude, you have no offers, you have no attribution, and you don't amplify anything, yeah, that won't work. So if you want results, use a system, right? If you don't want results, then just go out and have fun, random conversations.
And that's usually one of our first questions with prospects for us personally is, what is your goal with this? If it's just I want to get on interviews, random interviews, and I just want to talk, or I just want to be on this platform, then that's okay. That's fine. It's knowing what your end goal is, right? But it's really when there's an alignment of goals and purpose with the system of podcast interview marketing. Um, and so yeah, we talked about knowing your audience, right? That's the key component. None of the other four items will work if you don't have the right audience. Um, Once you get that audience, we talked about attitude of showing up the right way. This is a conversation, it's educational, it's not a sales pitch or a keynote. We talked about having the right offers, right? Not just one, but having three so that you can meet those listeners where they are. Ways to attribute those results, right? The welcome page is the best thing we found. I know, Tom, you do a lot of podcast interviews yourself and speaking engagements. Personally, you still have hits on your welcome pages from 5+ years ago from an interview you may have done, right? And we see, oh, people still really enjoy this interview. That was a really good interview. That was a really good audience message match. And then last is tying it all together, that amplifying, the repurposing, that content. If you think the average person speaks, what is it, like 150 words a minute? Think of how much content and information you might get from a 30, 45-minute interview, right? That's a lot of content to repurpose and reformat into all kinds of other mediums. So it's kind of doubling up your work there, right? It's helping your marketing team come up with content for blogs or emails or videos, audiograms, whatever. So there's the five pieces. So is there another step to consider that? Once you move past those five, is there something else?
Those are the 5 foundational pieces. And I can usually audit a podcast pretty quickly and show you what pieces are missing. But still, I've had people that have said, this isn't working. And it's really a timing issue, right? I can think of one client very, very early on. It was probably a month in. We've gotten her on these great interviews. She just had her first one recorded. Everything was going great. About 2 days after the recording, she called me up and she said, this doesn't work. And I'm like, what makes you think that? And her answer was, well, I did it 2 days ago and I haven't got any website traffic. I haven't gotten any leads. She didn't realize that this wasn't like radio. It wasn't like Facebook where you do something right now and you know the results the next day. The host had heard her interview, maybe the producer, the editor had heard it. But besides that, no one else had. The data says that it's about 42 days mean time from recording to going live. Now, after it went live, her answer was a whole lot better, right? A whole lot different. She's like, this works great. Or we've had people that say, I just want to try this for a month or two, right? To see if it works. Well, you won't know if it works in a month or two, right? We talked about that the mean time between the invitation to recording is 30 days and 42 days from recording to going live. And then in the first 30 days, you get 80% of the listens, right? So right there, you're talking over 3 months before you can really make a decision based on one data point, right? This, like you said, is more of a marathon than it is a sprint. And often we'll have people that, I tried TikTok for a month. It didn't work. I tried blogging for a month. It didn't work. And they're spinning from things to things before they even get the qualitative feedback, right? Of, is this working or not? If your sales cycle is long, podcast interview marketing may shorten it, but it's not going to make it immediate, right? How long does it normally take you to get leads, to get customers? So put that into effect. And that's one of those things that we talk with clients. If you're not committed to this as a marketing strategy for a year, then try something else, right? This is a marathon, not a sprint. And the thing is that they get, after 3 months, all that content to repurpose. And now they don't have to worry about what they're going to put in social media. Then every podcast starts building upon itself as they get the backlinks, their SEO, their organic search goes up, their social media following goes up. They get leads. And like you said, the leads are, I don't know if they're evergreen, right? I don't know if they'll last forever, but it's probably like a can of soup, right? It's probably good for 3 to 5 years. So everything builds and builds. So that last thing I would say, if you've listened to this and you're like, yep, I've got all 5 of those, I would ask, have you given it the time to make sure that it really works or it doesn't work?
Absolutely agree. We know that from experience. We know that from your own personal experience, from the experience of our clients at Interview Valet and it again, it's all about your approach. Like you said, if you want quick results next week, this may not be for you, and that's okay. But it's about it's something to see it as you're incorporating it into your business model, right? It is another piece that will always be there. Like you will always probably maintain your website or your different social media accounts. It's kind of like a piece of that will just kind of always be evolving. You may increase or decrease your fluctuation of interviews, but it's something that should always be just in rotation in your marketing plan. But all of this is great, Tom. I think we spoke before we hit record here today that you and I could probably talk about this all day, right? We could go off on any side tangent of anything we pointed out. But I think all this was really valuable in talking about, just going back to that initial question of the rebuttal, of when we hear someone say that podcast interview marketing doesn't work. And I think we hit the nail on the head here today with that.
I hope people will listen to this and think, what's the missing link? And try to figure out, because what could help the world, right? And just doing random podcast appearances doesn't help you, and it doesn't help the world. So let's figure out what the missing link is and start getting you results from every podcast appearance.
Absolutely. And with that, Tom, where can our listeners find you and the things we talked about here today?
Yeah. So most of the time I do my little after talk and say where you can go to find these things. We'll put it right in here. So just go to the show notes, podcastinterviewmarketing.com. Look for this in the show notes. And we talked before, how many calls to actions are there? There's 3, right? Small, medium, and large. So first one, we've got a checklist, goes through the 5 areas there. What is missing? Give yourself an audit on how your last interview, figure out what your missing link was. That's the small yes. The medium yes. If you want to read a book, I wrote the Bible of podcast guesting. At least that's what they call it. It's called Podcast Guest Profits. If you want a copy of that, happy to give you a copy of that. If you're in the States, we'll mail you a copy. If you're overseas, we'll email it to you. And then finally, if you're listening and you're like, this makes a lot of sense, if you'd like to talk with our team on how we could help you do this, just go to Podcast Interview Marketing Show. We'll put the calendar link there and you can get in touch with us.
Well, and with that, thanks for talking with me today, Tom. And until next time.
So what steps were you missing that kept you from results? Now, I'll go back and listen to some of my interviews, and there are times where if I don't see results, I missed 1 or 2. It's not about being perfect. It's about being better. So I'd encourage you, find 1 or 2 things where you're like, I'm weak in that area, and make an intention to get better on those. What could help so many people. Stay strong. The world needs to hear you now more than ever.